I didn't know abandonment could be so quiet until the day my sister walked out of my life and never looked back. My name is Claire Morgan, I'm 29 years old. And this is the story of how my sister's betrayal broke me and how I rebuilt myself when she decided I was no longer worth staying for. If you enjoy real-life stories like mine, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. For most of my life, people described my sister Emily and me as inseparable. She was 2 years older, louder, more confident. I was the one who followed, who listened, who filled in the gaps. We grew up in a small suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, sharing a bedroom with mismatched furniture and whispered secrets long after we were supposed to be asleep. When our parents divorced, Emily became my anchor. When I left for college, she was the voice I called when the world felt too big. So when people say, "I can't imagine my sister doing that," I understand exactly how they feel. The day she abandoned me didn't involve shouting or slammed doors. It happened through silence. A silence that stretched so long it eventually became permanent. It started the year everything in my life fell apart at once. I'd just lost my job after the company downsized. My long-term relationship ended 2 weeks later. I moved back into a tiny one-bedroom apartment I could barely afford and told myself it was temporary. Just until I got back on my feet, Emily had always been the stable one. Married, homeowner, 2 kids, a life that looked finished, polished, and safe. When I called her, embarrassed but hopeful, she told me to come stay with her for a little while. She said family takes care of each other. I believed her. At first, it felt like old times. We drank coffee together in the mornings while her kids watched cartoons. I helped with school drop-offs and cooked dinner when she worked late. I sent out resumes during nap time and reassured myself this was just a rough chapter, not the whole story. But something shifted. Emily started keeping score. How long I stayed. How much space I took up. How often I reminded her of the version of herself she'd outgrown. The comments came quietly at first. Jokes about me still figuring things out. Little reminders that her life had moved on while mine had stalled. I told myself I was imagining it. That I was just sensitive because I felt like a failure. Then one night, after the kids were asleep, she sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "I don't think this arrangement is healthy anymore." I laughed nervously, waiting for the rest of the sentence. It never came. She told me I was too dependent, that my presence was disrupting her peace, that her husband felt uncomfortable with me there. None of it had been mentioned before. There was no warning, no conversation, no chance to fix anything. She gave me 2 weeks to leave. I packed quietly. I didn't argue. I didn't cry in front of her. I told myself that once I found a job and stabilized, we'd talk it through like we always had. That this was just stress talking. After I left, the text slowed. The calls stopped. When I finally asked if we could talk, really talk, she replied with one sentence, "I think it's better if we take some space." Space turned into months. Months turned into a year. I watched her life continue through social media. Birthday parties I wasn't invited to. Holidays I wasn't included in. Smiling family photos where I no longer existed. When our parents asked why I never came around, Emily told them I needed distance to work on myself. She rewrote the story without me in it. The betrayal wasn't just that she asked me to leave. It was that she erased me afterward. She abandoned me when I was at my lowest and then convinced herself it was self-care. I spiraled in ways I never admitted out loud. I questioned my worth. My place in the family. Whether I had ever truly mattered to her at all. Some nights, I sat on my apartment floor and wondered how someone who once held my hand through childhood nightmares could turn away so completely. But here's what I didn't know then. That silence would force me to hear my own voice for the first time. That losing her approval would slowly free me from chasing it. And that rebuilding my life without my sister would teach me something I never learned while she was still there. I thought her abandonment was the end of my story. I had no idea it was the beginning. The first few months after I left Emily's house were the hardest, not because I was completely alone. I still had friends, coworkers, parents who checked in, but because I kept waiting for her to come back. I told myself she just needed time. That once the stress faded, she'd realize she'd overreacted. I replayed every conversation, searching for the moment I could have fixed things if I'd said the right words. I sent the first message a week after I moved out. Just a simple, "Hey, I hope you're doing okay. Miss you." She didn't reply. 2 weeks later, I tried again. I told her I had a promising interview and thanked her for letting me stay when things were bad. That one got a response. 4 words, "Glad things are improving." Nothing else. That's when it started to sink in that this wasn't temporary distance. This was a choice. I found a job eventually, not my dream job, but something steady. Administrative work at a mid-sized logistics company. It paid the bills, it gave me structure. And every time something good happened, I caught myself reaching for my phone to tell Emily. Only to remember she wasn't interested in hearing it. Holidays were the worst. At Thanksgiving, my parents split the day awkwardly, trying to keep the peace. Emily hosted lunch for her family. I came over for dessert, arriving just as guests were leaving. Her kids hugged me like nothing had changed, and that almost hurt more than the cold politeness Emily offered. She talked to me like a distant cousin. Pleasant, surface level, safe. When I asked if we could talk privately, she said, "I don't want to reopen old wounds, like I was the one who caused them." I drove home that night with a hollow ache in my chest, finally admitting something I'd been avoiding. My sister wasn't just avoiding conflict, she was avoiding accountability. That realization marked a turning point. Instead of chasing her explanations, I started paying attention to myself. To how small I felt whenever I tried to earn my place back in her life. To how often I'd played the role of the understanding one, swallowing discomfort so she could stay comfortable. I started therapy shortly after. Not because I thought I was broken, but because I didn't trust my own perspective anymore. I needed someone neutral to help me untangle what had happened. In one of the first sessions, my therapist asked, "What do you think your sister gained by pushing you away?" The question stunned me. I'd spent months thinking about what I lost. I'd never considered what she gained. Control, I realized. Simplicity. A life without mirrors. Emily had built a version of adulthood that worked because it was tidy and predictable. My presence unemployed, uncertain, rebuilding reminded her how fragile that stability really was. Instead of sitting with that discomfort, she removed it. It wasn't cruelty in the dramatic sense. It was convenience. That understanding didn't erase the pain, but it grounded it. It made the abandonment less personal and more revealing. I stopped sending messages after that. Not out of spite, but out of self. Weeks turned into months. Months into a year. My life slowly filled in around the empty space where my sister used to be. I got better at my job. I moved into a brighter apartment. I made friends who knew me not as someone's younger sister, but as myself. Still, grief came in waves. Sometimes it hit when I passed a store we used to love. Sometimes when I heard a song from our teenage years. Sometimes for no reason at all. I'd mourn not just the sister I lost, but the future I assumed we'd share. Growing old together. Inside jokes at family dinners. Being each other's emergency contact. One evening, out of nowhere, Emily called. I stared at my phone in disbelief as it buzzed on the counter. My heart raced. My hands shook. A year of unsaid words crowded my chest. I answered. "Hi," she said, like we'd spoken yesterday. We exchanged pleasantries, weather, work, the kids. It all felt surreal, like slipping into a costume that no longer fit. Finally, I asked why she'd called. "I just wanted to check in," she said. "Mom mentioned you seem different lately." Different, not happier, not stronger, just different. "I am," I replied. "I've been rebuilding." There was a pause. "I'm glad," she said, though her tone suggested uncertainty, not warmth. I waited for more. An apology. A question. Anything. It didn't come. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, phone resting on my knee, feeling something unexpected settle in. Disappointment, but also clarity. Emily hadn't called to reconnect. She'd called to assess whether I still fit into the version of the story she told herself. And when she realized I didn't need her approval anymore, she didn't know what to do with that. That night, I wrote in my journal until my hand cramped. I wrote about how abandonment can masquerade as boundaries. How silence can be louder than cruelty. And how rebuilding your life means deciding who gets access to it moving forward. I didn't know yet whether my sister would ever truly come back into my life. But for the first time, I knew something more important. If she never did, I would still be okay. And that realization terrified me almost as much as it healed me. After that phone call, something inside me finally shifted. For the longest time, I had been living as if Emily's absence was a temporary condition, like a storm I just had to wait out. But that night, sitting alone with my journal open and the city humming outside my window, I admitted the truth I'd been avoiding. My sister wasn't on a break from me. She had stepped away intentionally, and she was comfortable there. Once I accepted that, the rebuilding became more honest. I stopped framing my life as until things are fixed with Emily. I stopped imagining how I'd explain my progress to her someday. I started making choices without factoring in whether she'd approve, notice, or care. It felt unfamiliar at first, almost wrong, like I was betraying a rule I'd followed my entire life. Growing up, Emily had always been the benchmark. If she liked something, it was good. If she disapproved, I reconsidered. I didn't even realize how deeply that dynamic had shaped me until her absence forced me to stand without it. Therapy dug into that. My therapist asked me to describe my role in the family using one word. The word that came out surprised me. Adjustable. I had always been the one who adapted, the one who moved, softened, waited, compromised. When Emily needed space, I shrank. When she needed support, I showed up. When she needed distance, I disappeared. That flexibility had once been praised as maturity. Now I saw it for what it was, self-erasure, disguised as loyalty. Around that time, I was invited to a coworker's birthday dinner. Nothing fancy, just a group of people laughing over shared plates and cheap wine. At some point, someone asked about my family, and I hesitated before answering. I have a sister, I said slowly. We're not close right now. No explanations. No apologies. No defense. The world didn't collapse. No one demanded details. They nodded and moved on. That small moment mattered more than it should have. It taught me that I didn't owe anyone a softened version of my pain. I could tell the truth plainly and still belong. Emily, meanwhile, stayed exactly where she was. She sent occasional updates through my parents, nothing direct, just information. The kids started school. They were thinking about moving. She was busy. Each message reinforced the same reality. I existed at the edge of her life, not in it. The anger arrived later than I expected. It came quietly, not as rage, but as grief with teeth. I was angry that she had abandoned me when I was vulnerable. Angry that she'd framed it as self-care instead of avoidance. Angry that she'd let me carry the shame of the fallout while she stayed comfortable. But beneath all of that was a deeper anger I didn't want to face. I was angry at myself for accepting it for so long. One night, after a particularly heavy therapy session, I pulled out an old photo album. Emily and I as kids, matching pajamas, arms slung around each other, smiling like the future was guaranteed. I cried harder than I had in months. Not because I wanted that version of her back, but because I finally understood that loving someone doesn't obligate you to tolerate abandonment. You can grieve what was real and still refuse what is harmful. A few weeks later, my parents invited me to a family gathering. Emily would be there. I almost said no, but something in me wanted to see who I was now in the same room as her. Not to confront her, not to fix anything, just to observe. When I walked in, Emily looked surprised. Not upset, not angry, just unsettled. Like she hadn't expected me to take up space so comfortably. We exchanged polite hellos. Nothing more. I noticed how often she glanced at me. How her conversation stalled when I joined a group. How she seemed unsure where I fit now that I wasn't chasing her attention or orbiting her mood. At one point, she pulled me aside. "You seem good," she said, studying my face. "I am," I replied. There was no triumph in my voice, just truth. She hesitated. "I worried you'd hate me." "I don't," I said honestly. "But I don't build my life around you anymore." The words landed heavier than any accusation ever could have. She nodded slowly, like she was filing that information away, unsure how to respond. Then she rejoined the others, leaving me standing there with a strange mix of sadness and relief. That night, driving home, I realized something important. Emily hadn't abandoned me because I was unlovable. She abandoned me because I no longer fit the role she needed me to play. And when I stopped trying to squeeze myself back into that role, I stopped feeling lost. I didn't know what our future relationship would look like, if there even was one. But I knew this for certain. I was no longer rebuilding my life in the shadow of her betrayal. I was building it in the light of my own strength. And in the next part, that strength would be tested in a way I never saw coming. The test came from a place I didn't expect. 6 months after that family gathering, my mom called me one afternoon with a tightness in her voice I recognized immediately. It was the tone she used when she was trying to stay calm while managing someone else's emotions. "Claire," she said, "I need to talk to you about Emily." My stomach dropped, but I stayed quiet. "She's going through a rough time," Mom continued. "Her marriage isn't stable right now." I closed my eyes. Of course it wasn't. Emily's life had always looked perfect from the outside, but perfection requires constant maintenance. And cracks don't disappear just because you refuse to look at them. "What does that have to do with me?" I asked gently. There was a pause. Then, She asked if you'd be willing to help. Help. That word carried years of expectation. Mom explained that Emily and her husband were separating, at least temporarily. He'd moved out. The kids were confused. Emily was overwhelmed. And suddenly, the sister who once told me my presence disrupted her peace needed support again. She's asking if you could stay with her for a bit, Mom said. Just until things settle. I felt a strange calm wash over me. Months ago, this request would have sent me spiraling. I would have rushed in, eager to prove I was still useful, still worthy of being kept. I would have minimized everything she'd done and told myself, family always comes first. But I wasn't that version of myself anymore. I can't do that, I said. Mom sounded startled. Claire, she's really struggling. I know, I replied. But moving back into her house isn't healthy for me. There it was, a full sentence, no apology attached. Mom sighed. She feels like you're punishing her. I chose my words carefully. I'm not punishing her. I'm protecting myself. That distinction mattered. A few days later, Emily called me directly. Her voice sounded thinner than I remembered. Tired, raw. Mom said you won't come help. I won't move in, I clarified. That doesn't mean I don't care. She exhaled sharply. You're the only one who understands me. I need you. The old pull tugged at my chest. The urge to abandon myself so she wouldn't feel abandoned. But I stayed grounded. I can support you without sacrificing my stability, I said. I can help with childcare occasionally. I can listen. I can recommend resources. But I won't put myself back in a position where I'm disposable. There was silence on the line. So you're setting conditions now, she said. I'm setting boundaries, I replied. There's a difference. She laughed bitterly. You've changed. Yes, I said simply. I had to. She didn't yell. She didn't accuse. She just went quiet in a way that told me she was recalibrating, trying to understand this version of me, who no longer folded on command. I don't know how to do this without you, she admitted. And for the first time, instead of feeling flattered or burdened, I felt clear. You'll learn, I said. Just like I did. After we hung up, my hands shook. Growth isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it feels like standing still while everyone else adjusts around you. Over the next few weeks, I helped in ways that didn't cost me my sense of self. I picked up the kids from school when Emily had mediation meetings. I brought groceries. I listened without trying to fix everything. And when she crossed a line, criticizing my choices, minimizing the past, I named it and stepped back. Not angrily, firmly. Something unexpected happened. She started respecting it. Not perfectly. Not consistently, but enough to notice. Enough that I saw a glimpse of a healthier dynamic trying to form, even if she didn't fully understand it yet. One evening, as I was leaving her house after dropping off dinner, Emily stood by the door and said, "You don't owe me this." I looked at her, surprised. "I know." She swallowed. "Thank you anyway." It wasn't an apology, but it was honest. Driving home, I realized how far I'd come. I was no longer rebuilding in reaction to her betrayal. I was choosing my actions intentionally, aligned with who I wanted to be, not who I was afraid of losing. The final shift came quietly. On an ordinary day, I was offered a new position at work, more responsibility, more creative freedom, and a leadership component I'd once been too unsure to pursue. When I signed the offer letter, I didn't think about how it would look to Emily. I didn't wonder if she'd feel threatened or impressed. I just felt proud. That night, I sat on my couch with a glass of wine, reflecting on everything I'd survived, the abandonment, the grief, the slow, deliberate rebuilding of a life that didn't revolve around someone else's approval. Emily had walked away when I needed her most. But in doing so, she forced me to become someone who could stand on her own. And in the final part, I would understand the most important lesson of all, that forgiveness doesn't always mean reconciliation. And healing doesn't require the other person to change. By the time I truly understood what healing meant, nothing around me looked dramatic anymore. There was no big confrontation. No emotional apology scene. No moment where Emily suddenly became the sister I'd lost. Instead, healing showed up quietly, in the way my life finally felt like it belonged to me. The promotion at work settled into a new routine. I had my own team now, people who trusted my judgment and didn't need me to shrink to make them comfortable. I noticed how differently I carried myself, shoulders back, voice steady, no reflexive apologies for taking up space. The woman who once felt like a guest in everyone else's life was gone. Emily and I stayed in contact, but it was different. We spoke when there was something real to say. Not out of obligation. Not out of guilt. I helped with the kids occasionally, on my terms. I showed up for birthdays, school events, moments that felt appropriate. And when things became tense or emotionally loaded, I left before old patterns could resurface. At first, that unsettled her. She was used to me staying too long, listening too much, absorbing everything so she wouldn't have to. When I stopped doing that, she didn't always know where to place me. But slowly, she adjusted. One evening, after I dropped the kids off at a friend's house, Emily and I sat on her porch in silence. The air was cool, the sky fading into dusk. She looked tired, not in the dramatic way she used to perform exhaustion, but in a quieter, more honest way. "I didn't realize how much you carried for me," she said suddenly. I didn't respond right away. She continued, staring at the yard. "When you left my house back then, I told myself you were too much, too needy, too disruptive. But the truth is, I didn't want to see myself through your eyes. You saw things I wasn't ready to face." There it was. Not an apology, but accountability. "I couldn't stay and keep shrinking," I said calmly. "It was killing me." She nodded. "I know." We sat with that truth, letting it exist without trying to fix it. That night, driving home, I realized something important. I no longer needed her to fully understand or validate my pain. I understood it myself. And that was enough. Forgiveness, I learned, isn't about restoring access. It's about releasing yourself from carrying resentment that doesn't serve you anymore. I forgave Emily, not so we could go back to what we were, but so I could move forward without bitterness weighing me down. Reconciliation is optional. Healing is not. There were still moments of grief. Times when I wished I could call her the way I used to, laugh without caution, feel that automatic closeness we once had. But those moments passed more gently now. They didn't swallow me. They reminded me of what I survived. 1 year after the day she asked me to leave, I did something symbolic for myself. I took a weekend trip alone. No family, no explanations. Just me, a small coastal town, and a notebook I'd been filling since the worst months of my life. I sat on a quiet beach, listening to the waves, rereading pages written by a version of myself who felt abandoned, unworthy, and terrified of being alone. I barely recognized her. I wrote one final entry that morning. She didn't abandon me. She forced me to find myself. When I came home, I framed that page and hung it in my apartment. Not as a reminder of pain, but as proof of growth. Emily still struggles. Her life is still messy. Mine isn't perfect either, but the difference is, I no longer confuse chaos with love or sacrifice with loyalty. I no longer beg to be chosen. If my sister wants a relationship with me, it exists within mutual respect. If she doesn't, I grieve it without losing myself. That boundary is non-negotiable. And here's the truth I wish I'd known sooner. Being abandoned by someone you love doesn't mean you're unlovable. It means they couldn't meet you where you were. It means they chose comfort over connection. It means the relationship was conditional and you stopped paying the price. I rebuilt my life not by proving her wrong, but by choosing myself consistently, even when it felt uncomfortable, even when it felt lonely. Especially then. If you're listening to this and you've been left behind by someone who was supposed to stay, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not broken because someone walked away. You are not too much because someone couldn't hold you. And you don't need their return to justify your worth. Sometimes, the person who abandons you is the one who unknowingly hands you your freedom. And sometimes, rebuilding your life after betrayal isn't about replacing what you lost. It's about becoming someone who will never abandon themselves again.